There's something you are going to find about the priest that receives tithe. It's not every priest that receives tithe. The priest that receives tithe is the priest that has nothing else doing except serving God. Because the Bible stated it clearly. They have no inheritance. So this arrangement is done to mark for them an inheritance. You see, in this generation, somebody is working, is a bank manager and is pastoring. He's a real estate mogul, and he comes and collect tithe from 2,000 people and add it to his investment. That's where there's problem. If you are a priest that you don't have any other job, that's all you are doing. Because if you study the Old Testament, you are going to discover that there are some Levites that are soldiers. There are some Levites that are farmers. It is the Levite that does not have a portion, an inheritance, that receive tithe. So if you are a real estate expert, if you are a real estate mogul, if you are a businessman who is a pastor, you can't receive tithe. Let me show you some scripture. Numbers 18, 24 and 26. See the Bible. Numbers. Instead, I give to the Levite as their inheritance the tithes that the Israelite present as an offering to the Lord. He said, I give it to the Levite as what? Their inheritance. That is why I said concerning them, they will have no inheritance among the Israelites. Are you seeing this? So the priest that received the tithe is the one who is sold out, serving God completely. Go to verse 26. It says, speak to the Levite and say to them, when you receive from the Israelite the tithe I give you as what? An inheritance. He said, you must present a tenth of that tithe as the Lord's offering. This is what we call tithe of tithe. So when the Levites collect the tithe, they now take 10% to the high priest, who is also completely sold out to God. So if you go to verse 28, you are going to see what is done to the tithe of tithe. Go to verse 28. He said, in this way, you also will present an offering to the Lord from the tithes you have received from the Israelites. And he said, from this tithe you must give the portion to Aaron the priest. So this is one of the administration of tithe. There are many businessmen who are pastoring today. They collect tithe and go and invest it in their business. That's not right. It's not every priest that receives tithe. And I will show you why. Because there's an administration for tithing. Let's look at the administration a bit. The first administration is that tithe is for the welfare of the priesthood. And that scripture we read already shows you. They don't have an inheritance. They don't have a farm to go to. They don't have a business to run. They are serving the altar all the days of their lives. So part of the tithe is for their welfare. But it's also not just for their welfare. Another administration of the tithe is for administration and the running of the operation of the house of God. You'll see that in Leviticus or Deuteronomy 12, 11 to 17. Deuteronomy 12, 11 to 17. Those of you who are ministers here, learn this. Don't collect tithe and go and invest it in your real estate. If you have a job, you can't take tithe. I will tell you where the tithe will go to. Any priest who is overseeing a house and has a job, the tithe is taken to the house of God. It is put in the treasury of the church. It doesn't go to the priest. The only priest who can receive tithe is one who has nothing doing. So that the tithe represents his welfare and the company of the priest. And then number two, the tithe is used for the service of the house of God. It said, then to the place the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name, there you must bring everything I have commanded you. Your burnt offering, sacrifices, and your tithes and special gifts. You see this? So it's possible to have a priest who has a job. It's possible to have a priest who is doing something else. If that is the case, the tithe is brought to the place where God has named his name. Go to the next verse. It says, and there rejoice before the Lord your God, you, your sons, your daughters, your male, your female servant, your Levites, and your town who have no allotment or inheritance of their own. Next verse. It says, be careful not to sacrifice your burnt offering anywhere you please. It's where God names his name that you take it, including the tithe. Next verse. Offer them only at the place the Lord will choose in one of your tribes, and there observe everything I've commanded you. I'm taking you to a verse. Go on. Nevertheless, you may slaughter your animals in any of your town and eat as much of the meat as you want, as if it were gazelle or deer, according to the blessing the Lord your God gives you. Both the ceremonially unclean and clean meat may you eat. Next verse. It said, but you must not eat the blood. Pour it out to the ground like water. Next verse. It said, you must not eat in your own towns the tithe of your grain, of your new wine and olive oil, and firstborn of your herds and flocks, and whatever you have vowed to give, or freewill offering or special gift. Did you notice what he said there? He said, you must not eat. What does that mean? That means there is a time when you eat your tithe too. But how do you eat your tithe? You bring it to the house of the Lord. When you present it, if there is a ceremony, money, if there is an activity where the priest takes from, is from the tithe. So for example, you have an event in the house of God. You are not going to go and beg money from outsiders. What you do is that you take from the tithe and everybody will eat it together. So both the priest and those who brought it can partake of it. For example, when we have our end of year program, where do you take the money from? You don't go and solicit for money to come and run that program. The administration of the tithe becomes for the celebration and the organization of the things of the house. So the first administration of tithe is for the welfare of the priest that has nothing doing, because the priest that serves the altar eats from the altar. The second administration of the tithe is for the organization and the running of the house of God. So everybody can partake of it at that time. Then there is a third administration. Deuteronomy 26 verse 12, for widows, for orphans, and for strangers, because it is part of the responsibility of the church to take care of widows that are widows indeed. Are you seeing why you can't be a bank staff or a real estate person and collect tithe and go and spend? Tithe is a sacred seed. God prescribed how it should be used. He said, when you have finished setting aside a tenth of all your produce in the third year, the year of the tithe, he said, you shall give it to the Levite, the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that they may eat in your town and be satisfied. So when tithe comes in, if other administration has been met, you take it and you look for those who are widows. It is the duty of the church to support them. And Paul gave us the criteria for the kind of widow we support in 1 Timothy. It is church. But you see, a man of God collects tithe, he thinks it's time to buy car. You are joking. You will have a problem. Even if the tithe is a leftover after your, that's why I was teaching the other time. I say it's wrong. In our era today, it's only the high priest that collect all the tithe and he builds a mansion. All the other Levites in church are dying. It is wrong to have a minister serving in the house of God who is sold out and there is no token going to him on a monthly basis. It's wrong, because he doesn't have an inheritance. He has set himself apart. He left his certificate. He left everything to serve God. So even if it is the high priest that collects the tithe, if he takes the 10th portion of the tithe, the 90% of the tithe remaining is number one for the other pastors. That's the administration of tithe. And then after you take care of the other pastors, you now take care of orphans, widows, and strangers. Where we are here, sometimes people come, they say they are from Lagos, they don't have where to sleep. I say, okay, give them something to sustain them for 3 days. That's one of the duty of the tithe. We have widows here who don't have food to eat. Give them. And if we don't have those to give, sometimes we go out for orphanage visitation, because the tithe is meant for the orphans. It's meant for the widows. It's meant for the welfare of the subordinate pastors who are the Levites. But here today, only the man of God, the set man, collects all the tithe. And there's no administration to the tithe. He buys car, he builds mansion, and he invests the rest in his real estate business. Do you see why we still keep giving tithe? Because if you stand up now and say, oh, Jesus has become the tithe, we don't need to give tithe. How do we take care of the widows? How do we take care of the orphans? If we want to run a program in-house, where would the money come from? Otherwise, people will be overburdened. You want to do graduation, you say, please sow a seed. You want to do end of year program, you say, sow a seed. You want to go out for orphanage, you say, sow a seed. Is it every day they are giving? People will run away from the church. This church of giving every day, what is going on? So God creates an administrative buffer to run his program without becoming overbearing on the parishioners. This is how tithe is administered.